Welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations. Today, my guest Kevin Shah is here to talk to us about empathy. What is empathy? Why is it so important? But we're also going to be specifically talking about interactions with people who don't have, or at least don't exhibit, a lot of empathy, right? Because when you get into difficult conversations about contentious topics, right, whether it's social issues or politics or religion or whatever, oftentimes people behave as if they have no empathy, right? And you're sitting there going, what is wrong with you? So we're going to talk about how can you help other people get empathy? Can you help other people develop empathy? Is there ways you can conduct yourself to encourage them to be more empathetic? Honestly, we haven't done a whole lot of pre-chat. I don't know exactly where this conversation is going to go, but it's definitely going to center around those topics related to empathy. So thank you so much for joining me today, Kevin.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really excited to get a chance to talk about my favorite superpower, which is empathy.
Absolutely. Well, I guess a good way to start is let's just define, like, when you're talking about empathy, like, what is that? I feel like that's a word that a lot of people have different definitions for, and maybe a lot of misconceptions too.
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that because some people sort of think empathy is the same as compassion, and so let's quite just understand what empathy is. And empathy is the active process of putting oneself into the perspective world of another. And so what that means is you're trying to see or understand more so understand the perspective of someone else. And so that's why it's different from compassion. Compassion is more sort of thinking of feeling for someone, while empathy is trying to understand their perspective. And there's three different kinds of components to empathy. There's the cognitive empathy, which involves using one's logic to perspective take on another situation. And this is learned through reasoning and connecting with another through thoughtful reflection. Affective or emotional empathy, this is focused on one's emotional response to another person's feeling or perspective. Affective empathy is a deeply felt connection that allows a person to experience another person's emotions. So if I see that, John, you're feeling sad and I'm feeling sad with you, that's sort of like that emotional affective empathy. And then there's the component compassionate empathy, is the ability to sense the needs of another and feel driven to take action to help them. So this is where you're feeling their feelings, you understand their perspective, and you're understanding their needs. And so now you're sort of compassionate, you're trying to drive to that, how do I help them? How do I cope? And not take them out of the space, but sit with them and then help them come out of it or whatever that might be, or help meet that need. And so it's really important to understand that when we talk about empathy, we don't conflate it with this idea of compassion or even with sympathy. That's a really big difference. There is sympathy is if you fall into a well or if you hurt yourself, I'm like, oh, you hurt yourself, that sucks, sorry for you. But empathy is like, you hurt, oh, that must hurt really bad, I can imagine, like, oh, that sucks, oh my god, let's feel that pain. And then now let me, you know what, can I bring you a band-aid or put it on or whatever that might be. So there's that difference in feeling, because if you get hurt and I say, oh, that sucks, and I show sympathy to you, at the end of the day you're still hurt and you feel alone, you feel like I'm feeling that pain. But in empathy, you feel someone else is there with you, feeling that pain or feeling that feeling, the joy. It could be any of those feelings. And that's why it's so powerful, because when you don't feel alone and you feel understood, that's what builds those connections.
That is such an interesting breakdown of empathy. I feel like I now have a better understanding of it before, in that there's the cognitive empathy process. So I don't know if I'd lump those two together, but I have noticed when I'm, doing episodes like this, when I'm in a sales conversation with a prospect, when I'm talking to a friend about a loss, like when I'm in those situations where empathy is needed, it feels like a mental exercise. I don't even know how to describe this, right? Because there's not exactly nerve endings in your brain, but I can tell you my brain feels similarly when I'm engaged in that cognitive empathy as when I'm like trying to figure out a difficult math problem. Like it is absolutely a mental activity to say, okay, let's strip away my perspective, my understanding, my biases. Let's tuck that away and let's start loading in a new perspective, a new worldview. Let's start filling in the gaps where it's missing. And let's try to really understand how the world looks with this new perspective on. And it's a mental exercise. For me, that part of it isn't even necessarily a heart, emotional, body, visceral exercise. It starts with that mental exercise of, okay, let's put on their worldview and see what it looks like from in here. Now, oftentimes, once I put myself in their worldview and I see the world through their eyes, then suddenly I start feeling their emotions after. Like, oh, wow. And then it becomes a visceral body felt.
Yeah.
But for me, it starts with the cognitive empathy, which is, again, it's just a mental gymnastics trick, right? To be able to
Yeah.
strip away your own perspective and put another one on. Is it the same for you, or do you think other people go about it in reverse motion of emotions first, then leading to mind?
I would probably, I don't want to speak for all people, but I think it could be a combination of either or situation. I definitely think that sometimes you feel some of the emotions first because it's a situation you're familiar with, or you can see the emotions, physical reactions of the emotions of the folks. And
Yeah.
I think where it comes into play is because the steps of learning empathy and how do you learn or how do you practice empathy, that might come into help answering some of that, like that question you have. To be able to be empathetic, it is important for us to understand ourselves.
Mhm.
Self-empathy, that's a really important aspect. If we understand who we are, or how we want to be understood, because if we understand our feelings, and if you think about it, a lot of people don't even take a moment to reflect on their feelings. How did this movie, you watched a movie, how did this movie, ask yourself, how did this movie make me feel? Or how
Yeah.
did that character in this movie, or how did this story make me feel? We don't a lot of the times take that pause to reflect on our feelings. So understanding ourselves, self-empathy, is the first step. And so that's where the difference comes in. Some people might reflect on themselves cognitively first and then the emotional, or some people might feel the emotion and then ask themselves, why am I feeling this emotion, and then go to the cognitive. And that's where those two components could play in differently.
Hang on. That is huge. So make sure I'm following here, right? Correct me if
Yeah.
I'm. I just described empathy as this mental gymnastics tricks of peeling away your own perspective and biases,
Mm-hmm.
knowledge set, and trying on that of another. You said that the first step is to understand yourself. And that makes sense because if you're going to peel away aspects of your own
Mm-hmm.
perspective and bias, you have to
Exactly.
go through the process of flagging and identifying what your own perspective, your own worldview, your own, like, you have to have gone through the process of actually mapping out in your mind, okay, what is hard objective fact about the world? What is my perspective? What is my baggage? What is my bias? What is my background? Because you can't peel those things away if you haven't identified what they are. So even
Yeah.
if you want to be empathetic, if you haven't mapped out your own self well, when you try to like peel away your own perspective to make room for theirs, it's not going to work because you haven't actually identified what is your own perspective that can be peeled away. And then there's no room for theirs because you haven't
Yeah.
found. Oh my.
and and there's situations even on LinkedIn that I was commenting. Someone was commenting about privilege and explaining to me how I had the understanding of privilege wrong. And it
Mhm.
was very easy to understand that they were not taking the perspective of others. They were saying, I see privilege as this way. Whereas it's like,
Yep.
listen, it's not about how I see privilege. Privilege is when it impacts someone. So similarly, in this, absolutely, if we are not able to understand ourselves, it is very difficult for us to understand others. And that is what empathy does, is helps us understand others. And so when we start understanding ourselves, then we know that, oh, I am seeing this color, or this refrigerator, or this computer with this perspective. That this computer might be a laptop, but someone else might see it as a tablet. But I need to understand that this was my perspective. And if someone says that it's a tablet, and I'm saying, no, that's not a tablet, that's my perspective coming in. So understanding yourself. So yeah, absolutely agree how you framed it. So that was the first step of learning empathy. And so going into that mental gymnastics thing you talked about, and the cognitive aspect of it, once you understand yourself, and then the next step is deep listening. You want to really listen. And a lot of the times, and I did this a lot, and I still am working on it myself, is when we are talking or when I'm listening, I'm thinking about what am I going to respond with, or how am I going to respond to this, or what is this triggering to me that I can bring up and share, versus am I just listening to understand what their emotions are, what their motivation is, what are their needs, what is their perspective. And that's an important part. So when we are talking about that mental gymnastics, it's part of listening, is listening with our brains, listening with our heart. And then the next step is, now let's take that perspective. Now I understand myself. I've understood them. I've absorbed it. Now, even before I think about responding, let me put myself in their perspective, see that worldview, and feel and think with them.
Yeah. To me, it's always felt like once I've stripped away my perspective to be more or less, close to a blank slate state, Then I start getting information from them, from the words they're saying, and I start putting together another picture, another view. And if I'm really focusing on it, I start to notice where there's things missing. And I'm like, hey, hang on, wait a minute. You said this and you said this. Am I correct in assuming this? Right? And like, that's the level of listening I have to be at to really be my best. Where again, I've set aside my own stuff and I'm creating a model of the world from their perspective. And again, I tend to ask a lot of good questions because I notice there's gaps in this model that I need filled in for myself.
Yeah.
Like, if I wasn't interested in creating an accurate mental model of the world, I wouldn't notice the gaps, right? I just take the things they told me and debate the things they told me, and I would never notice, right, the gaps. So I wouldn't have full understanding.
Yeah, and exactly. I love how you put that in a sort of visual representation, because I think as you think about it, we fill those gaps with our assumptions, and that's why we're not deep listening. Like you'll say, "Hey, Kevin, I really like sports." I have now, I've been like filled in a lot of the gaps. Oh, he likes sports. He must be a jock pro, or he must love beer, or he must. I don't know this. I haven't asked you these questions. I don't know that perspective. Am I listening, or am I just filling in my assumptions?
Yeah.
So in this case, he must like sports. Let me understand why. So deep listening is then getting to that why.
And it goes back to that self-awareness thing where if you don't have your brain well mapped and well flagged, you won't notice that's an assumption, right? Like if you have the self-awareness, you'll hear data, you'll fill in an assumption, and you'll go, hang on there, buddy. I've identified like this as an assumption. Let's set this aside for a minute and ask a question to fill that in instead. But if you haven't done that level of self-awareness, you won't notice you just filled an assumption in there.
Yeah.
God. I never knew self-awareness was so closely tied to other awareness, right? Empathy. I thought
yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think a lot of people, when we talk about empathy, they're thinking, oh, empathy, why is that so important? Why is it such a powerful thing? It is powerful. If you think about it, if a person is feel understood and heard, that means I feel understood and heard. That means we are building a community, we're building a relationship. So when we think about it, we are able to then come together based on that understanding and do whatever we want to do together.
All right, third step. So there was 4 steps, right?
Yeah. So you take that perspective and understand. You put them in. You sort of follow. So sorry. Let me reset that. Coming back to self-empathy, then it's deep listening, then it's perspective taking. Put yourself in their perspective, and then understand what the world through their perspective, and then acknowledge that perspective. Acknowledge it. Not try to change it. Not try to fix it. Acknowledge that perspective. And then the last piece is the piece where you come in to say, okay, now that I understand it and I see that perspective, now let's see it together. And then now bring in your perspective, their perspective together, and now you're able to come in and understand each other. And so that sort of ties into that understanding. So that builds, that's the building blocks that you're building on top of.
Yeah. And I think, we got to highlight there, right? The word acknowledge is not the same as the word validate, right? You can acknowledge a perspective without necessarily putting your stamp of approval on it and saying, yes.
Exactly. You don't have to agree. That's a very important part. Being empathetic and practicing empathy does not mean you agree with someone. I don't agree with a lot of the politicians or some of the leaders in the world. Doesn't mean I can't understand their perspective.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. All right. So now we got a decent, understanding here of what empathy is. So I guess the question is, how do you conduct yourself when you're engaging with someone and they are demonstrating a clear lack of empathy, right? Is there any way you can, I don't know, help them along to get them to a more empathetic place through your behavior and your actions, lead them to empathy? Or is it just a matter of you got to learn to deal with it? They don't have empathy and they're never going to have empathy.
Yeah. So this is a very relevant question, because the data is showing over the last 30 years that we are going into an empathy deficit, increasingly, the empathy deficit in our communities, and it is manifesting, and you're seeing the results of it. Polarization in our world, it's not just in the United States. Globally, the polarization is massive that's happening in communities. People are talking past each other. People are not listening. It's my view or your view, and that's it, and we're against each other. So you're seeing that impact of the empathy deficit right now, and there's data that backs all of this up. The piece that comes into so why I brought this data up is because that is a very real, a big reality that we are facing right now, where the polarization, where we are talking to folks and on all sides, and we are not being empathetic. And even if the other person is showing lack of empathy, the way you approach that is by showing empathy. If someone is not showing empathy, the way you approach that is you try to understand the why. This person not able to show empathy, or are they not showing empathy? What happened? What ends up happening, and this is one of the hardest things to do. I'll be honest. If it's might I might say it and might seem easy, but it's one of the hardest things to do, and that's why it's not happening as well. But it is once if you are able to achieve it, it is one of the most powerful things that can happen. So if someone is showing lack of empathy, for example, I am simple example, I fall down and I sort of hurt myself or scrape my knee or something, and someone is there and they're like, that's that must hurt, or that sucks. Showing sympathy but not showing empathy in that moment. I in that moment, how do I sort of bring in them to, like, because I need empathy in that moment. I'm hurt, I'm in pain, I don't know, maybe I don't know how to get up, maybe I broke my leg, I don't know how to get up or something. How do I show empathy? It's like, okay, I need to understand, how do I help them see my perspective through their perspective? And so in this moment, I would probably say is like, oh, can you imagine how it would feel? Ask the questions. It all comes to curiosity and asking questions. Some of the time people don't even ask themselves, like, could you imagine how it would feel if this happened to you? And then that forces that perspective taking from their perspective first. And they're like, yeah, if I feel it would hurt. Like, now imagine, like, in this situation, how I'm feeling. Oh, I'm feeling because you just told me how I would feel in this situation. And so that's sort of like the basic step to sort of break through that initial barrier that people put up. The people, like, in reality, if we ask ourselves, why do people have that barrier to empathy? And why do they put it up? It's likely because they have faced some trauma or something that has happened in their life. No one, I don't believe people are inherent. I don't believe in good people or bad people. I think those concepts have been created that to create more divisiveness in the world, maintain hierarchical structures. It's really just people who have high levels of empathy and low levels of empathy, and they just not had the opportunity to be more empathetic. And some just people sometimes make bad choices. I've done some shits in my life. I've done some made bad choices. It doesn't make me a bad person. It doesn't make anyone a bad person. It's your actions and the choices you're making that are either based on empathy or they're not based on empathy, and there's some choices might be bad. And yes, there are, and that's why there, as you can see, there's some leaders that are polarizing. We know Donald Trump divided the country in a big group that 74 million people voted for, and then there were 77 million who didn't, right? So there was this experience where there was a lot of people who loved him, who thought he was amazing, who thought that he did great things, and there was the other side who saw the other perspective of it. And so if just said that's a bad person, that's a good person, that by definition, by just saying, is we're not being empathetic to that person. And so we need to understand that perspective.
So here's something really telling. It's almost a little embarrassing to admit, but I'll go ahead and use myself as an example here. So due to increasing polarization and the effect of the media and everything that's going on online, I kind of came into this series of courageous conversations with the general opinion that part of what made people on the political right and conservatives the way they were is that they lacked empathy as a group, and that people on the left generally had empathy as a group. One thing that I have been finding as I have these conversations is that it's not that simple, right? That clear division of good people, bad people is not that simple. And here's the other thing that's really interesting. When I reached out to you, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, whatever, Kevin, to get this scheduled. Actually, no. So before I even reached out to you, I saw your LinkedIn profile and I had an idea for an episode, right? Before I ever reached out, and I kind of noted it down. And the episode I came up with was kind of what this is titled, How to Engage with Low Empathy People. Because at that time, maybe January, maybe February, I still had the perspective there was people out there with high empathy, there was people out there with low empathy, and the reason people on the right were the way they were is because they had low empathy. And that's why that idea for an episode came up. Since I've had more conversations, I've realized it's more complex than that. And that title for this episode of like how to engage with low empathy people just didn't seem quite right, which is part of why I diversified the question stream here, because I've started to think to myself, I don't know if it's as simple as some people have empathy, some people don't, good people, bad people. So here's my question to you. To what extent is there truly a difference in empathy score? Some people have a lot, some people have a little, and maybe even some people don't have the capacity for empathy, right? And just like that, the empathy muscle in their brain is, shriveled and hardly working. And to what extent is it more a matter of when and where you apply the empathy. I almost think that empathy is something that can be like engaged and used in a given situation, or it can be set back and chosen to not use in a given situation. So when I come online and I see someone not using empathy, I tend to assume it's because they don't have any empathy to give. But it may be just because for one reason or another in that particular situation, they're not approaching it with empathy. But in other areas of their life, they may be the most empathetic person out there, right? So
Yeah.
it's not necessarily I have it, you don't. It's a matter of I'm choosing to approach the situation with empathy. You're choosing to approach the situation without it. It's something that can be turned on and off depending on the situation. And more than likely, everyone has very similar amounts of it. It's just a matter of when we decide to use it or not.
Right.
So those are two opposing views, right, of
Yeah.
empathy. Which do you think represents reality better? What's the right blend?
Yeah. So in my opinion, I think people who are not demonstrating empathy are because they haven't felt empathy from others. So I'll just use like someone commenting on a, let's say, controversial post on Twitter or LinkedIn. And that could lead to a lot of just back and forth and leading to lack of empathy. And typing is a hard place to demonstrate empathy. It is
Yeah.
communicate empathy for sure. So spaces like with someone who's not felt empathy. So just let's say for the people on the right who might feel like they're not feeling understood and heard. And but Donald Trump was the leader that made them feel understood and heard. So they got really excited. Because if you think about it, what are they saying? They're saying, I am not feeling seen. I am not feeling understood. I am not feeling heard. Because you on the other side are just saying, I'm a horrible person.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So, and then, so when they come into a space, then they might not want to demonstrate empathy for others because they haven't felt it. So like, why should I do it for anyone else? Because I haven't done it. Right. And
Yeah.
because that is human nature. It's for us evolutionary. We are sort of protecting ourselves there, our survival at that point. So the spaces where people don't demonstrate empathy are spaces where they feel that either they might come across weak, that vulnerability might be misconstrued as a sign of weakness, or that you are not able to do your job in that situation, or you might come into a situation where you maybe tried and then you didn't get it back, so now you've put up that barrier in that situation or in that space. So I would say, in my opinion, empathy, that you want to practice empathy in as many is whenever relevant. When you're with yourself, when you're with others, building those connections. When you're trying to build connections, when you're trying to network, when you're trying to do work, influence. Most of our jobs, when we're working at companies, when we're working in a office space or we're working with people, even though we might have authority, but at the end of the day, we want influence. Influence trumps authority because influence means I am got people who are rallying behind me our mission or with me on a mission. I I can have authority and say, oh, I am controlling your salary and you're going to come after, you're going to join me, but that only gets you so far. But if you really want people to join you on whatever mission we're on as a company, or whatever mission we're trying to achieve, or goals we're trying to achieve, you want influence. And in those moments, um, you want to practice empathy, but there might be moments where empathy might not make sense, and that might be where you have to make some tough decisions that
Mm-hmm.
are just hard, but even though you make those with empathy, so like for example, if you have to lay off, let's say your company is not working out or you're losing sales and you have to stop end it, in that moment you can still understand like, hey, I let me acknowledge that this is going to be shitty for all of us, this is going to be horrible for all of us, I'm in this position as well. Let me share my story so you understand where I'm coming from. So this is where you want them to understand you and understand why this decision is hard and want others to practice empathy for you. And that's a really important aspect of um, of why empathy in some spaces means when someone doesn't practice it, the other people need to practice it for that person to bring them out, to show that vulnerability is a courageous act, it is a strength, and empathy is something that can help bring that out.
So do you think by showing someone else empathy, that does encourage them to reciprocate with empathy of their own?
Absolutely, 100%. I would bet money on this. I do that all the time. If I run into experiences where I feel a little um, not understood, I share my feelings. I have removed shame from my life. I've worked very hard to remove shame. Shame is that piece that is holding us all back. Then we give each other shame. We shame each other, we shame ourselves. And so I share, I'm like, oh, in this moment, this is how I feel. I'm just letting you know without no expectations back. And more often than not, they're willing to, oh, you see that I've taken my guards down. I am here naked as I come in my feelings, in my experience. No cards, hiding, nothing like that. I'm just here. And that enables people to come back. And I've had conversations where that leads to like, okay, you know what? We're both learning. We may disagree, but I get it. We don't have to hate each other. How empathy prevents us to go down that hate route, that shame and hate filled hole that we've ended up being in.
Yeah. So here's something I find interesting. Oftentimes, people on the political left see things being said or done by people political right and accuse them of not having a lot of empathy. Right? I was very much in that camp too. It's really easy.
I was.
Yeah. And our reaction on the left is to respond to them in a very unempathetic way.
Absolutely.
Jordan, what you're saying is very counterproductive. In fact, if anything, that encourages that person on the right to hide their empathy even deeper. Whereas you're saying that if person on the right shows up without empathy in the situation, and then we see that happening and we show up with empathy for them, right? Not empathy for this other group, but empathy for them, that may encourage them to bring their empathy to the table and make that part of the conversation.
Yeah, so a very relevant story I would share here is, so I went on a work trip. I went to Arizona, and I was invited to dinner with my husband's uncle and aunt. I had never met them. They had never met me. My husband wasn't with me, so I was alone. So this was our first meeting with these folks. They're retired, living in Arizona, boomers, loved their life. Everything's great. And they told me during dinner that they voted for Donald Trump because they wanted the wall. They wanted the wall and the border. And I'm an immigrant. I'm an immigrant to the United States. So in that moment, I could have done two things. I could have said, one, you're wrong. The wall doesn't do anything. Data is showing that most of the undocumented immigration that's happening is coming from either the northern border or the airplanes or all these other ports of entry. This wall isn't really doing much. I could say all of these things, and which they've probably heard many times, and they'd have shut off and moved on. Nothing would have changed. In that moment, what I did was I said, let me share my story about my immigration. I came here on a plane for a student visa, and over this time, I've spent $20,000 to $30,000 immigrating into the United States. I am now a United States citizen, but it took all this work. And then during my green card interview, where I'm sitting there with my husband and this officer, we were in Florida, and I was having my green card interview. I could feel that every time the officer was looking for a reason. And this is right after gay marriage was legalized, and we were one of the first people to go through this process. And I felt like they wanted to find a reason to block me. And they did. In fact, they came up with, you bought a house. That means this is a fake marriage and you were trying to live here. I'm like, anyone in the world can buy property in the United States. There's no law against that. But they put that on the paper, and then it got to their supervisor that removed it, and then it got approved, and I got the green card. I'm sitting there crying. I'm in a mess. I'm like, what am I going to do? I love this person. This is my life we built together. What am I going to do? They're going to kick me out tomorrow. And I just shared that story with them. And at the end of that meal, they heard that story. And then they're like, I didn't realize it was more to this. I didn't realize this. And their perspective changed.
Yeah.
And because I was able to share, be vulnerable. I didn't challenge their perspective. I didn't challenge their worldview. I didn't say they were wrong. I just shared my perspective. They were able to then empathize with me.
Yeah. It's so powerful. So one thing that's kind of shifted in my perspective, like I briefly mentioned earlier, is that when I see someone showing up in a way that is not empathetic, I've stopped to make the generalization that, oh, they just don't have empathy, and started to just say, well, for some reason, they're choosing not to bring their empathy to this discussion, right? Doesn't mean they could be just as empathetic as I am, but they're choosing not to bring the empathy to this discussion. And something I've thought about too in other contexts is that we all have to do this from a logistical standpoint. Like, you can't possibly show up with full empathy to everything you ever see, learn, or hear. Like, you'd be a mess, right? Every time a headline came out about people dying somewhere and problems in the world, you'd just be a total mess from over empathizing with every problem anyone ever has. So we all do have to, at a certain point, say, I'm not showing up with my empathy right now. I got things to do. I just heard a bad newspaper headline, but I'm not bringing my empathy to the table right now, just because you need to. right?
Yeah.
And I
Yep.
think one of the differences here is that when you choose to show up with empathy for any situation, particularly like when it's, bad news or something, you can choose to either localize or personalize the situation and focus on the individual and the person being affected, or you can choose to kind of zoom out, globalize, and generalize the situation and just kind of look at it on a wide scale. I'll give you an example of this. This November, we we wake up in the morning, we open the blinds, and on our back porch is a huddle of kittens. And it's like, where the hell did these kittens come from and why are they here? And
Mm-hmm.
my wife is like, let's personalize, humanize, localize the situation. These poor 5 frightened little kittens, they're in the cold, there's no food, there's no one to take care of them. What would you feel like if you were the small little kitten? Like, she very much turned on her.
Mm-hmm.
And my first reaction was to decide to leave my empathy behind and say, you know what, honey, this is a neighborhood that has way too high of a cat population. We probably got hundreds of cats in this area. It's a known fact that more cats go into the winter than survive coming out of the winter. It's just a natural part of life that every winter we have 200 cats going in and only 100 cats come out, right? Cats freeze to death, cats starve to death. I don't like it, but it's just part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing we can do to change this. So let's just wash our hands of this kitten situation and let them work out their own
Mm-hmm.
fate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I decided to kind of globalize and broaden my scope, leave my empathy behind, and view it that way. And she chose to, more humanize it and, personalize it and view it from their perspective. But I think we always have that choice in every situation. Either it's with a person in front of us or it's with, news we hear, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can choose to either take the big view and say, hey, in the grand scheme of things, this isn't that big, or we can decide to take the more zoomed in view and get really worked up about it. I think this is where a lot of times when people talk about what happens with immigrants on the border and the kids in cages debate, right? One group is deciding to zoom in and personalize the situation and imagine being a kid in a cage without your parents. And it is truly appalling to them that anybody is okay with that. But of course, people on the other side are deciding to kind of zoom out a little bit and say, well, we have a border, we have laws, something has to be done. It may not be great, but this is the real world we're working in. You got to just do the best you can, and it's not always the best. And again, it's not necessarily a matter of one group has empathy, one group lacks it. It's just one group has decided to invoke a zoomed in view and engage their empathy, and one group has decided to take a zoomed out view and tune their empathy down. But it doesn't necessarily mean one's a good person, one's a bad person. It's just they're making choices in that moment about how to view it. Is that, I don't know, is that accurate? Am I looking at this the right way? Would you get anything to push?
I think the way you're looking at it, it makes sense to me that yes, it's the choices of how they're looking at it, and it's their perspective. Exactly. I'm seeing it as, I'm sure that if you took them down to the cages, they would also, like the people who have zoomed out would also say, yeah, this is shitty and this sucks. I'm because I believe that most humans are able to understand those nuances. But they are looking at this view, this larger view. But what the question is, the people who are looking at this larger view, are they looking at this larger view to help make sure that these smaller views are the perspectives that are inhuman, are completely taking humanity away from people? Are these pieces something that we can solve? So like in the situation of your cat story, you say, yep, there's a large number of cat population. So what is the empathetic response at a more macro level to do that? Could we go volunteer or donate to help neuter or spay some of the cats in here so that this more cats are not suffering and dying?
Yeah.
So like maybe you take those cats that arrive at your door and like, hey, we're going to take them to the shelter, and so and make sure that they're neutered and spayed so that the problem doesn't escalate further, and then we're solving the more macro problem. So there is an empathetic approach at the macro level. The difference is people who might be seeing at a macro level, are they not taking it like, oh, this is how it is, sorry, sucks to be you, I'm happy in my $1 million mansion, sucks to be you. That's the difference here. The difference is, I understand that this is the macro problem. Now let me see how do I make sure that this smaller human things, or the perspectives at the human level, at the one-on-one level, is not propagated further. And that's where empathy can come in both places. It's just that which perspective you're looking at. And I think both perspectives are important to be understood so that we can get to that answer.
It's interesting. I was kind of assuming that the zoomed in approach had to be empathetic and the zoomed out approach had to not be empathetic. But you're presenting them as independent variables, right? You could have zoomed out and empathy. You could, in theory, I guess, have zoomed in and no empathy.
Yep.
They might make it easier, right? Obviously, this approach makes it hard to not be empathetic, because you're right. If those people who were, didn't care about the kids in cages visited those facilities, it'd be really hard for them to hold on to that like unempathetic view. But it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be that way. You could have zoomed in view without empathy. You could have zoomed out with empathy.
And the whole the problem that we are facing with the houselessness, people who do not have houses and are out on the streets and living, and then there's this view of, oh, they're just into drugs, and then that puts it away. That is an example of an unempathetic macro response. That is an example of not understanding the macro problem at all, taking your perspective, adding assumptions, and then bam, and this is the answer. When in reality, it's probably a different perspective. If you think about it, to live on the streets, you might really need drugs. I imagine myself, I said, if I had to live on the streets and survive in the cold or survive in the rain and to be able to sleep at night, it probably makes sense for me to have heroin, because otherwise I would have to kill myself at that point. And it's that powerful. So there is an important part to understand that even at macro level, it requires empathetic understanding, and there are unempathetic responses to those as well.
So something just came to me as you were talking. It seems like there's a cost to empathy. There's a emotional cost, and mental cost. It's draining to care and it's draining to feel. But in some cases, when there's something you can do about it, there are more tangible costs, right? So in the cat situation, if I decide to start volunteering with my local, animal shelter to take care of the cat problem, there's definitely a time cost. There's possibly a monetary cost. So empathy, there's a cost to empathy. And people almost will say defense mechanisms when they feel like they don't have the capacity to take on any more empathy cost, when they feel like they're empathied out and they don't have capacity to like take on that cost, is the zoomed out approach makes it very easy to put empathy in, right? Yeah, well, it's a problem from the beginning of time. There's no way to fix it, so let's just not worry about it, right? People die every day. Or the other one you brought up is the dehumanization approach. These just drug addicts, who cares about them, right? When you strip the humanity from someone, you don't have to use empathy when you're with them or suffering, which makes it easy. And to me, dehumanization is the very most dangerous thing humans can do and engage in, because when you dehumanize someone, it no longer triggers the same empathy response, which is typically a safeguard against horrible behavior. Right? You look at every terrible thing human beings have done to each other in time, it's always preceded with dehumanization, because you can't do terrible, awful things to a human being without it wrecking your mind and your psyche. However, if you do terrible, awful things to a subhuman being, now there's no damage done. So it's like empathy has a cost. So when you're trying to avoid that cost and you're like, dude, I just can't handle any more empathy right now, I'm maxed out, you globalize the situation, which helps you drop your empathy, or you dehumanize, which helps you drop your the need to feel empathy.
Yeah, and also I think it's one thing we need to understand, that we have to, part of that self-empathy is to understand what your limits and boundaries are. Because if we aren't able to maintain those, then we won't be able to help anyone, including ourselves. And so that's important to understand that. So there is that empathetic response to yourself. Is like you said, I am at a point where I'm at my limit right now. So I need to take a break. I need to move out of this space, whatever that might be. And you can do that by acknowledging, yep, this is terrible. I'm acknowledging this is terrible, but I do not have the capacity right now. So let me come back. So you don't have to globalize and make it not your problem, or say this is not my problem, or this is how they are. You can just acknowledge, and that's a vulnerable act to do. It's courageous to say, I acknowledge this problem, but I don't have the capacity to manage this or deal with it or feel with it. And that is an empathetic response in itself, because that's basically an empathetic response to yourself and acknowledging their problem rather than dismissing it.
But that requires, right, the self-awareness piece to feel like, hey, I'm at my capacity right now. And it even requires a certain amount of like confidence and resilience to shame, where you can say, I don't have the capacity for this right now, without it triggering a shame response like you're a shitty person, right? Because that's, if you see suffering in the world and you decide to turn a blind eye to it, it's pretty easy to start feeling like a shitty person. So when you see suffering in the world and say, hey, I don't have the capacity for that right now, no thanks, it makes you feel terrible and it makes you feel shame. So I think that's why people don't normally go that route. They normally go with the dehumanization route, or they go with the globalization route, because you can take those routes and not have to wrestle with shame. But to simply say, I acknowledge it's a problem, but I'm going to put a boundary here and say I can't get involved. That if you're not emotionally intelligent and haven't done a lot of good inner work, that can trigger shame. So
Yeah,
that's something
yeah,
that people take.
yeah, absolutely. Shame is probably the most the key, I think, element that is sort of causing a lot of the bad choices we make in our lives. Shame is probably at the root of it. Like when I used to, like in college, I had a bad situation led to abuse and stuff from on inflicted upon me, and it came out of shame because I was so shameful of something, and then I kept adding more lies to that, and then to prevent that shame and building, it ended up building more shame and more shame. And so a lot of the bad choices that are made in the world are either to hide your shame or prevent shame or some level of shame that comes into play. So I like that you put it that way as well. Is it is important for us to understand that acknowledging a problem and acknowledging that you are unable to participate or feel or do whatever is not a shameful act. It's in fact a courageous act. It should be celebrated. If someone asks for help and you say, sorry, I am unable to help you, you should not feel shame for that. You should feel glad that you recognized it. And the other person should feel like, yeah, they recognized, they understood me, they saw me, I feel seen, but they also acknowledge that they didn't have the capacity to help.
Yeah. So if you witness that person who's choosing a non-empathetic response, hurling shame at them isn't going to help, right? Because shame is
Hurling
what's
shame ever
responsible
doesn't help.
to this non-empathetic
Shame
response.
shame has never done anything positive for anyone at all. Like one of the tricks, one of the tools that my mom used to use when I was growing up as a punishment was shame as a punishment.
Sure.
She would say, you have to get completely naked and you're going to go stand outside the house where in the public area for like an hour, and that's your punishment for some stupid thing I did. And that is just shame. That is just, now I'm going to shame you for your body. I'm going to shame you for physical body. I'm going to shame you for in public, front of your neighbors and friends. And that's trauma. We are
Yeah.
using trauma as punishment at that point,
Yeah.
right? And so shame has never delivered anything positive in the world.
Yeah. God.
And so empathy is, like Brene Brown says this so well, the empathy is the antidote to shame. Why empathy is so important, it's mission critical in the world, is because to remove shame, which can remove our largest problems. In fact, I'm writing about this right now, which is to solve climate change, to solve some of the biggest problems that we're facing as in the world. It is not an individual response. Individually, I can recycle a little bit better tomorrow, but that's not going to solve climate change. Mm-hmm. And someone can say, yeah, if everyone did it, but that means we need a community response. And it's even if everyone recycle, because of the system we built on recycling right now, even if everyone recycled with the current system, we would not solve climate change. Mm-hmm. Because we've built a system that doesn't really solve that problem. We need a community response to these global problems. And for a community response, we need to remove shame and we need to build empathy.
So, we've talked about how, there's probably no, or at least very few people out there who really don't have empathy. It's just a matter of when we choose to use it and when we choose to not use it.
Correct.
Part of this has to do with the in-group, out-group effect, right? Who are our people? Like, mm-hmm. I would say for most people, their immediate friends and family are their in-group at least, and they feel empathy for their friends and family. And who's the out-group, mm-hmm. right? And that is something that, again, I used to believe was the difference between liberals and conservatives. I don't know at this point. If you pin me down, maybe give an answer, I would say probably. I would say probably conservatives have a smaller in-group of like just their family, just their community, maybe just this country, where liberals tend to have a wider out-group of the whole community, maybe the whole world. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's my perception. But anyways, I think that determines when people show up with empathy, when people show up without empathy, right? When it's someone in the out group who's having bad things done to them, you tend to not show up with empathy, you tend to globalize it, or maybe even dehumanize them. But when it's someone in the in group who's suffering, you almost always bring empathy to the table. So do you think there's any way that we can help people expand their in group, right? People who only care about themselves, their family, and that's how small their in group is, get them to extend the in group to their whole community?
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Oh, absolutely. What you're basically saying is, Kevin, how can we get empathy at scale? How do we get people to expand that in-group to become more than the in-group and become that global level? That's how I understand this question. But that's exactly what I asked myself in 2020. How do you do this? And that's what led to building my startup, Jago, which is to basically build empathy at scale with an empathy gym platform where you can expand that in group to beyond your in group by listening to other stories. So how did I expand? So in the story I told about me sharing my immigration experience with some strangers that just happened to be related to me through marriage, I likely will probably never see them again, but
Hmm.
they were able to empathize with me. How? Because I just shared my story. I told them my truth, my story, my lived experience, my unique lived experience. So for them, they can, so for to expand that is just listening to other stories, not going in with your story is wrong or I don't believe your story. Just listen. And you'll realize that most of the people are at the end of the day, at the core fundamentally just want really happiness and fulfillment. And so
Yeah.
that relation commonality exists. And so if you just listen to other people's stories, you can expand your in group, because then you'll see and in our empathy gym in Jago, our mobile-based empathy platform, there's stories. We have hundreds of stories from people around the world. And so I personally am not religious. I am atheist. But I've because I own because I built this platform, I've watched so many stories of people sharing how they found religion later in their life, and I listened to their perspective. And then by listening to their story, I was able to understand why. Before I didn't do that, I was very like divisive in that. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, they're religious. Oh, I'm out of this conversation, right?
Yeah.
I was creating that in group versus that's my out group. Whereas here, I'm like, oh, there's just someone who really supports gay people, loves what they're doing, but they just recently found religion because this happened, and then there's their story, and I learned that, and so now I'm able to empathize what their experience was, and their stories also people who lost their religion, or they said, oh, I had this experience and I gave up the religion, I found this other thing in my life, and I understood their perspective and how they got to that. And so by listening to other people's stories and truly just listening and understanding that, and that gives you that expansive, and that's what we built in our empathy gym. It's really, we say 6 minutes a day, you watch 2 stories, you do a perspective take, and you see a measurable growth in your empathy skills.
And in the situation you mentioned earlier of the relatives and you sharing your story on this empathy gym, it seems like the anecdote to a small in group is stories from the out group. When someone hears stories from a member of the out group they resonate with, they
Mm-hmm.
will can't help but expand that circle
Yep.
to include
Yep.
that person.
Yep.
Huh.
Because stories are ones, because I'm sharing my story, I'm not challenging your story, and I'm not challenging your facts, I'm not challenging your perspective. It doesn't require defense mechanism. If I tell my story, so I'm telling you today, like, um, oh, on Fridays I sit with my husband and we have an hour-long chat about something, and we talk about our feelings, we talk about our relationship, and then we have, we will have a drink or we'll watch some shows, right? That is my story I just told you. You didn't have to say, no, you're wrong, or you didn't have to say, I didn't challenge any of your perspectives or your worldviews. So you come in with automatically, it's an invitation in rather than a wall up.
So if I'm holding all these strings right from this conversation, when someone's showing up without empathy, oftentimes they're doing it through either the dehumanization, defense, or the globalize the problem so it doesn't hurt defense. I would say this is probably almost the more common one, the globalization one, unless you truly, truly hate the out group. But in general, it's just a globalization thing. The anecdote to that is not like, again, an argument, a debate, changing their mind. It's to share stories with them from that out group. And eventually, after story from that out group hits, they will kind of decide for themselves to let go of that defense and embrace the more personalized human view of the situation.
Yep.
But again, you can't force them to do that. You have to kind of create the field where they themselves say, you know what, I'm going to stop looking at this from a global perspective and I'm going to go ahead and adopt it in the human perspective. Yes, there's an empathy cost to me, but after being exposed to all these stories, I almost can't resist shifting into the more personalized human mode of this.
Yeah, and to be honest, I would flip it to say, instead of empathy cost, I would say it's an empathy gain for me, because empathy is, I truly believe it is the superpower. So when you are practice empathy, you are building that superpower. On, like in an interview, if someone asked me, Kevin, what would be your super, which is a common interview question in tech, is like, what if you could have a superpower, what it would be? And my superpower would be, I want to understand every person. I want to understand every person. That's my superpower one. So I don't see it as a cost. I see it as this amazing power, this benefit to be able to understand people. And so the piece that absolutely takes time, it takes time to build. And for people who don't feel seen and heard, the best way to do that is tell your story. And that's what we've enabled. In the app, it's a user-generated library. We are not curating or sourcing content from like, hey, I need your story. Anyone's story, I say everyone's story matters. It's not just the person landing the plane in the Hudson whose story matters. Everyone's story matters. That mom in the grocery store who's looking for a specific item, that person's story matters. And so every story that you can share, and you share your story, you will feel seen and heard. And then if you feel seen and heard, you will see and hear other people, understand other people.
Yeah. So if you want people to show more empathy, start with giving them more empathy.
Yes.
That helps.
Tell your story. Give more empathy. Then they will share or demonstrate empathy. It takes a little bit of work, but the part that we all don't realize is it's taking more work to undo all the polarization and the shame and everything that we've done. So we're that is the cost. The cost of empathy is shame. The cost of empathy and the negative aspects that we're facing in our communities right now, that we are as a species facing a potential extinction threat, is already the fact that we're not been practicing empathy.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for this. We could go on forever and ever, but we'll go ahead. Thanks so much for. Got any final thoughts? Feel free to share them now as we can.
Thank you, John, for having me. This is what a great way to end the week for me, and a great conversation. I really did truly enjoyed it. Like for anyone listening, we didn't plan any of these conversations. It was a natural conversation. All we talked about is let's start with what is empathy, and how do we and why, what do we do when we don't feel empathy in ourselves. And it went out this amazing conversation. And I truly feel that you created a space for having these powerful conversations. So thank you for doing that, John. It's amazing work, and I feel honored to be able to share my perspective. And I usually don't end up saying that, but like I do feel seen and heard. So thank you for that as well.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here. You've given me so much to think about, a new lens to look at the world through. So thanks for that, and I will talk to you later.
Yep, take care.